Hi everyone, I'm Sandy and welcome back to my channel. Today I have my November reading wrap up for you. I almost said nonfiction reading wrap up, which there is a lot of nonfiction in this wrap up. I ended up reading a fair amount of nonfiction, far more than I normally do, which is not surprising considering that November is Nonfiction November. If you're not familiar with Nonfiction November, it is an event that is hosted by Olive over at a Book Olive, and she comes up with 4 wonderful prompts every single year, and this year was a lot of fun. So I had selected, I think, 8 or 10 nonfiction reads. I did not get to all of them. No surprise that I didn't get to all of them, but I did read a fair number, and far more than I normally would, which is part of what Nonfiction November is actually all about. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the books that I actually read, and then I'll share the few books that I did not get to. I wanted to, just didn't happen. So for the 1001 book list, I actually had 3 nonfiction and 1 fiction on the list. The 3 nonfiction were Ages for Hawk, If This Is a Man, and Cataract, and the one fiction was At the Mountain of Madness by H.P. Lovecraft. I did finish all 4 of those books. Ages for Hawk happens to have been the 100th book off of the countdown and was my book club pick for November. I have talked about all 4 of those books already, but we'll leave the video linked in the description below for you if you want to go and check those out. So outside of that, what did I end up reading for Nonfiction November? So the first book is a buddy read that I did with Ketavon from Ketavon Reads. I will leave her channel linked in the description below for you as well. And we read Welcome to the Goddamn Ice Cube by Blair Braverman. And so this particular book is a memoir of her time really in Norway as she is learning. She's a student. She is going to some of the schools up there where they help take care of dogs. She learns how to run dogs up there. But really, this is more about her life outside of running dogs. There was actually very little content about the dogs themselves. It was largely about her relationships, some of the traumatic relationships that she had while she was there, some of the isolation she felt when she was still a student while she was there, and kind of helpless to a certain point of getting, her parents were so far away, and even if they could have, even though they offered help, they weren't close enough to be able to provide any to her. And it's really about, from what I took of it, a lot of what those events, how they impacted her as an adult, as a teenager, and how she really struggled from that. And I think in the end, the dogs really helped to pull her out of a lot of that. But if you were looking for a book that is about dog sledding, about running dogs, about running the Iditarod, I would not read this book. It's not the one that is going to tell you a lot more about that. If you want to read a great dog sledding book, read Winter Dance by Gary Paulson, because that book compared to this one, no contest. That book wins. But the one thing, so it was lovely reading with Ketavon. It was our first buddy read, so I'm looking forward to our next one, whenever that ends up being. But this particular book, what was really interesting about this one, I got this one used through Thrift Books, and Thrift Books is one of my favorite places to get books because you can get books very, very cheap. You can get deals, you can get $3 books, you get free books. It's a whole thing, and I did get this one through Thrift Books. Now, what was really interesting is when it came to me. So this particular book, this book is actually signed by the author, and there's a date here. You can see here in this pen that there's a date. And in addition to that, there's actually a picture in this book of Blair Braverman. And this is an actual, printed picture, and it says, about to enter my first race ever, trying not to look terrified, and was printed on 12/7 of 2014. And the writing that's on the back of this picture looks very similar to that date. And then in addition to that, this book actually has a wide number of annotations and notes in it which look like they are from the author. So somehow it looks like I got a book where the author herself put notes in, and that was part of probably the coolest thing for me with reading this book, was getting to read a lot of the author's notes as I went through it. The book itself was disappointing. Unfortunately, it wasn't my favorite. I wanted something more. I wanted another Winter Dance book, and that's not what this was. But there's some really great aspects of it as she's trying to deal with all of these things that happened to her when she was a young adult, when she was a teenager, and those parts were really interesting. The part that I struggled with is the timeline of this book bounces all over the place. And if you watch my channel, you know that's not my favorite. So especially when it's hard to tell where you're at, and this one definitely did that. So Blair Braverman's Welcome to the Goddamn Ice Cube. Thank you, Ketavon, for reading it with me, though. And then the next book was a 5-star read. It's tied for first place as my favorite nonfiction in the month of November, without a doubt. And so the book is actually What We Don't Talk About When We Talk About Fat by Aubrey Gordon. I read this for the silence prompt because, you know, we don't talk about this topic. And this really goes through Aubrey's experience as a very, very overweight woman and all of the challenges that she had. It's similar in some ways to Hunger by Roxane Gay, but this book does something different. It does have those components of memoir. It does say these times where she's grocery shopping and someone feels the need to come up to her. She's in the produce department, mind you, and takes out a cantaloupe out of her cart because, you know, she doesn't really need the sugar. And Aubrey Gordon is someone who is not 20, 30, 40, 50 pounds overweight. I think at one point in this book, she weighed between 400 and 600 pounds. So significantly overweight, and just some of the challenges that she always had when she was growing up, when she was, it just all different kinds of pieces of when she was training as a swimmer that were really disruptive and difficult. She did not refer back to like a major trauma when she was younger, but she talked through a large amount of her youth and as she was growing up, and some very scary experiences she had. But where this book really made an impact with me was that it also attempts to educate. It attempts to educate about things like BMI and how BMI was calculated and how it is very discriminatory against different races. Also, that the BMI calculations designed to say who is overweight were changed overnight, and that 25% of the Americans became what was considered obese or overweight literally overnight when they changed those rules. It also at the end has some very interesting and actionable things in it. So it's not a book, again, it's not a weight loss transformation book. It's not something you're going to come out and go, wow, I'm super glad I read this. I now know what to do to try and lose more weight. That's not this book. It just gives you a really good, balanced perspective on this particular topic. And I loved this book so much. I thought she did an exceptional job and researched it very, very well, provided actionable things about what you could do, all of those different parts. I thought it was amazing. Highly recommend if you have any interest at all about learning more about this. It does touch on some of the same topics that Hunger did, but it goes into depth on a lot more than that, even though it is a fairly skinny book. Very, very highly recommend this particular book. Okay, so the next book that was on my TBR was also for the silence prompt, and I did this as a buddy read with Britta Bowler, and it is Kate Moore's The Woman They Could Not Silence. Oh my goodness, this book was amazing. It was wonderful reading this with Britta. It's always great. I feel bad because I postponed it I wasn't available to read it. And then I read it in like 5 days. So poor Britta. I was like, well, I'm done with that section. And then I'm done with that section. And yeah, it got very, very interesting very, very quickly. If you're not familiar with this book, it is actually about a woman whose name is Elizabeth Packard. And she is alive in the 1800s, married with children. And her husband, she has different beliefs than her husband does, especially about religion, about slavery, about different ideals that she doesn't hold the same as her husband. And she decides, she didn't decide anything. Her husband decides to have her committed to an insane asylum because she was problematic. She was causing him issues in the congregation. She was married to a pastor or a preacher. And he didn't like it. His congregation, sided with him, even though she was incredibly intelligent, by all accounts an excellent mother, and he just was able to have her committed because women at that time had no rights outside of the marital rights. And so she was put in an insane asylum for 3 years and fought the entire time she was there. And the doctor in the insane asylum was absolutely just maddening. And I loved this book because she fought and fought and fought, not only to get out, but after she was out, to change things for other women. And it was amazing. I was so surprised that I had never heard of her before, much like I'd never heard of the Doctors Blackwell. I'd never heard of Elizabeth Packard, but she was incredible. What an amazing woman. And she was threatened with being put back in an asylum multiple times by her husband when she got out, and she just was able to get out of that, and in the end became incredibly successful writing and incredibly successful in getting laws changed. So highly recommend this book. It is a chunky book, but wow, is it a fast read. And so if this topic interests you at all, absolutely read it, because it is a phenomenal book. Very well written, very well, just how the story was put together and told. And I think I told Britta this as well. If I had been married to someone like that in that time frame, I probably would have been committed as well, because one of the things that they said that could be considered insane behavior is reading a lot. Yeah, I would have been in trouble. But The Woman They Could Not Silence, I really want to read Radium Girls now by the same author. I am so incredibly impressed by this book. So yeah, I definitely would recommend The Woman They Could Not Silence. Okay, so the next book that I picked up for Nonfiction November was not on my TBR. I realized somewhere along the way that I hadn't picked up a new release, and I wanted to, and I happened to have one that was very interesting to me, and I decided to pick it up. And so it is The Next Everest by Jim Davidson. This book was actually published in 2021, so it's not this year released, but this author, Jim Davidson, is the author of one of my favorite books from this year, which is called The Ledge, which is about a climbing accident that he had in the 1980s where his climbing partner died. It happened to be a climbing accident on Mount Rainier, which is in my neck of the woods up here in the Pacific Northwest. So it's very familiar with Jim Davidson and his writing style. That book was such a good book. It was one of the few nonfiction books that actually made me shed a tear. So this book, I didn't even realize when I had purchased it was by the same author, but this book is about his experience climbing Mount Everest. And so my first question to him would be, why in the world did you go to Mount Everest? Why did you keep climbing after having that horrific climbing accident on Mount Rainier that was catastrophic for his climbing partner? But he went to Mount Everest in 2015. If you're not familiar, 2015 is the year that Nepal had their very massive earthquake, and it devastated parts of Nepal. And Jim Davidson was at Camp 1 when the earthquake hit. And if there's a new series on Netflix called Aftershock, which also talks about this time, and the images from it are horrific. And he talks about his experience at Camp 1, about not knowing what's going on, about how they couldn't get out because the ice fall had been, their route had been destroyed. People were all over Nepal were in serious need, so helicopters weren't available initially to come and get them. And in addition to that, base camp was virtually destroyed in places. And so it's about that part. That's the first part of the book, and he combines again his experiences with his dad with his climbing, and so it'll bounce back in history about some of the how he learned to be a good supportive climber, things like that, and then go back to the current time, which at that point was when he was in 2015 climbing Mount Everest. So he was able obviously to come out of that, and then in 2016 a bunch of the people that were on Everest in 2015 went back and were successfully able to climb Everest, and he just couldn't resist. The Nepal government had said that their permits were good for 2 years after that, and so if they wanted to come back, they didn't have to pay the tens of thousands of dollars it cost to climb Mount Everest. And so he went back in 2017, and that's the second half of the book, is him climbing Mount Everest in 2017. And I can't imagine stepping foot on on this mountain after that, or any mountain after the first accident. So it is a special and unique breed of person that is willing to climb these huge peaks like this. Very well done, though. It wasn't quite the 5-star read that The Woman They Could Not Silence was, but it was right up my alley with being a climbing book, a survival book. I love being outside. I love hiking, and I had read another book by him, and this one was definitely as good. There's some great pictures in here, but yeah, I can't see me ever climbing a mountain like this. So The Next Everest by Jim Davidson. All right, so that's the end of what I actually read for my nonfiction November reads. What I didn't read are these. Unfortunately, I did not read this stack of nonfiction. I just didn't get to it. I picked up the Next Everest instead for some reason, but I didn't get to Blue Highways by William Least Heat Moon. I did not get to Boys in the Boat by Daniel James Brown. This one is probably my most disappointing one that I didn't get to. It actually went on the plane with me because I had to travel to Atlanta, and I didn't read it on the plane. I don't know why. I was reading A Woman They Could Not Silence. I was reading At the Mountain of Madness, but I didn't get to this one. And then the last one that I didn't get to is this one, The Last Season by Eric Blehm. I just didn't have enough time. No surprise, but that's what I didn't get to in the month of November for nonfiction. Now for fiction, I did have a number of different reads. My 1001 book for fiction was At the Mountain of Madness by H.P. Lovecraft, and I did that as a buddy read with David Wiley, and I was able to finish that one. It was very short. So that was perfect. Exactly the length of a book that I actually needed. And then I had a couple of buddy reads. The first one was a group read with Fraser Simon, with Gemma from Gemma Books, and Sarah from Freshly Read Books. And we read the second book in the Wayfarer series by Becky Chambers called A Closed and Common Orbit. So this particular book, I went in thinking it was a sequel to The Long Way to Small Angry Planet, because it's the second book in the Wayfarer series. And what happened with this book that was surprising is this book is not on the Wayfarer. This book is on a different planet. The couple of characters that are in it were characters that were in the first book, but there were far more characters in the first book than in the second. So if you're going to read the series and you love the first one, just know the characters aren't going to be the same in this book necessarily. This book is told from two different perspectives and bounces back and forth from a current timeline and a past timeline. And the past timeline was the one that I found the most fascinating. I do have to say, though, I still like this book. I really enjoyed the characters. I learned how they were learning, how they were growing, and I loved hearing the backstory. Even though the backstory was on a character that wasn't very prevalent in the first book, this ended up being a really fun read. And it was really fun to read it with a group, even though we didn't have a lot necessarily to say about the pieces of the book. It was fun to get to just kind of react with people about, why are we not on the Wayfarer with this book? But that is one of the fiction reads that I read that was very successful, I would say. And then I did my first read with Anne Novella, and this was a book that she had seen on my TBR or on my Goodreads and asked me if I wanted to buddy read it, and it is Dubliners by James Joyce. This is not on the 1001 book list, but I had thought it was at one point, which is why I got added to a TBR on Goodreads. Okay. I'm not a huge fan of James Joyce. I have read Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man and now Dubliners, and I'm still not a fan. I wish I was. I do. This is a collection of short stories, and there are a number of them in here, and I would read a story and it would immediately leave me. There was nothing super impactful in it. I had the audiobook as well to try and dig into it. It was narrated by Chris O'Dowd, who is wonderful. He's a great narrator. I just didn't care about some of these stories. And then there's a great point where Anne had left me a Voxer message saying, the only story I remember is The Woman in the Boat. And my immediate thought was, there was a woman with a boat? I just didn't even absorb them. It didn't consume them. James Joyce is a struggle. So unfortunately, Ulysses is on my 1001 book list, and I am aware of that. I'm pretending like it doesn't exist, though, because I didn't enjoy Dubliners. I'm sorry if this is a favorite of yours. It was definitely consumable and readable. I didn't hate it like I've hated some other books, and I didn't love it. It was just kind of there, and it didn't stick with me. So Dubliners, that was the That was the other one that was on my TBR that I did finish. And then for some reason over the weekend, I just wanted to read something fun. So I put 5 books in, and you numbered them 1 through 5, and let Siri pick a random number. And Siri picked this book for me, which is The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune. I had seen this one all over BookTube, and I know that this book has really good and really bad ratings for it. People either love it or they hate it. They think it's too preachy or it's delightful. I just read it and didn't worry too much about the message in it. And I had a lot of fun reading this particular book. I liked the main character who was going to this house on the hill with these very special children to see if the house was okay, if it should be maintained, if it should, or it should be closed. And the relationships that he builds with the children, with the proprietor of the house, of the different creatures that live on the island. I love that. The message part can be heavy-handed, especially when you're talking about the city that's there and kind of the reaction of the people there and kind of how that was dealt with. I can see how the message can be heavy-handed without a doubt, but I had a lot of fun. I just read it. I enjoyed it. I read it over just a period of a couple of days. It was a great break from some of the heavier literature that I had been reading, and I just had a lot of fun with it. If you read it, just know it can definitely be heavy-handed from a message perspective. So, but if you just read it and enjoy the story, it's absolutely delightful. So yeah, pretty successful. I'm not going to lie. I think that this is a pretty successful reading month, even though I didn't get to everything. When you look at, this is my fiction, mine is At the Mountain of Madness, and my nonfiction, I don't know if I can pick all of them up. And my nonfiction. I mean, I'm pretty happy, not including the 1001 books, but that's a pretty good stack for nonfiction, even without the 1001 books. So yeah, very happy with my nonfiction November reading that I did, because wow, did I read some amazing books. I would highly recommend several of these for just about any reader. So, but that's what I had. The only other 2 books I had is kind of maybe on my TBR were The Streets of Laredo by Larry McMurtry. I'm reading that in December with Jack over at Spread Bookjoy, and then Middlemarch by George Eliot, which I'm reading with the Up to No Good Book Club, but we postponed it till January. So that's great. But yeah, 3 books that I didn't get to, officially 3 books, not too shabby. So that's what I have for you. Hopefully you enjoyed this wrap up. I know it's going to be a little bit long. I had a lot to talk about. But as always, like, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, everyone, thanks. Bye.